again, upfront, make sure that you have language in there to protect yourself, and then really identifying what that challenge is and then working together as a partnership. Because again, it's mutually beneficial if things work out.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, Gary and I are going to be speaking with Brian Bartel, Director of Materials Management with Mckenzie Willamette Medical Center. And Brian has been with us really since the very early days, Gary. And I know partly because you introduced Brian to us in some collaboration and work that you guys had done together. But he also really supports Power Supply, and he's also a member of the Power Supply Advisory Group. And so, Brian, very involved in our early success with the podcast, continuing to support. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But also, we're going to approach this as a little bit more of a roundtable because Brian's been a guest before, and we're going to be focusing on all things implementation, Gary.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I've always said it. Someone probably said it long before I did. You're only as good as the agreement is signed. That's it. You got to think about implementation because that's where the real work begins. And if we're not ready to have a successful implementation, then the agreement's not worth anything. So I think it's important that this dialogue goes on. I know, Justin, you'll have some key insight on this with Brian as well. And I think having this kind of panel focused, we are missing Hayes, but I know this is going to be a good one, and he'll be bummed he wasn't part of this one. So looking forward to hearing what Brian has to say, and yourself, and post-implementation after the agreement is a very important topic for our listeners to hear today.
All right. Stay with us, everybody. We're going to be right back with Brian Bartel after a short break.
I'm Hayes Walter.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Brian Bartel, Director of Materials Management at Mckenzie Willamette Medical Center. Everybody should know Brian by now. If you didn't know, Brian does our newsletter every single week. So if you're a subscriber to the email newsletter, it's Brian putting in all the work there. Also, if you are listening to this podcast and you have a CMRP certification and you are leveraging us towards your recertification for continuing education credits, Brian crafts the wonderful quizzes that go along with the episodes for the CECs. And we've got some other things in the works too, Brian, but you've been a guest on the show before, and everybody should by now be following our YouTube page and seeing our video clips on LinkedIn with lots of our, I don't know, I guess I'll call them like little micro learning videos, but really great stuff, Brian. You've really been a huge supporter since the beginning, and here you are on the show yet again. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect. Yeah, excited to be here again. Thanks, guys.
I think this is a great opportunity while we pause and we just kind of make the listeners feel more comfortable as Hayes is not here, but we will continue to Hayes while he's not here, which just really opens the door. I really miss seeing his white hair. I mean, it's almost Christmas. I mean, it's like he frosts it every morning. I think he has a professional hairdresser, but we miss him. We miss him today. So,
Gary, you're really taking this opportunity after you missed so many episodes.
I was working. You know what? Well, Hayes is on the golf course, hanging out, talking to people, working part-time. There's people that have to take care of mission and patients and staff while Hayes is just working on his golf game. So, sorry, Hayes, miss you. We love you, but we miss you. So,
well, today we're going to kind of change it up a little bit too. Like instead of, hey, Brian, lay some knowledge down on us, we're going to do this a little more round table. And we haven't really talked about implementation. I mean, a little bit. Maybe to the nuance of a particular topic, but we haven't focused on successful, post-contract agreement implementation and what that can look like and how to ensure that, all of these cost savings opportunities that we're chasing after are executed well. And so, Brian, I'd love to tee it up for you. I know, Gary, you do a lot of implementations in your day job, as you were kind of saying, I'm working. But I want to tee you up, Brian. Like, can you tell a story of an implementation that did not go well? It doesn't have to be in your current position, but maybe tee it up with, hey, this one didn't go well. And then we can start to dive into why it didn't go well and start pulling out some best practices from there.
Yeah, Justin, I'd love to do that, but unfortunately, I've never had an implementation go wrong. So I kid, of course. There's so many different examples, and it's a great question, Justin. I mean, really, and anybody that's worked in supply chain, whether it's in healthcare or outside of healthcare, can probably relate to that, right? You do all your due diligence. Especially in a healthcare setting, you're really trying to get the clinical teams on board, because if you're not bringing the clinical teams on board, you're going to have problems, right? I would never go into a supply chain in a healthcare setting and say, hey, we're going to switch even something as simple as underpads, right? Let alone implants or some of these more complex items. So one of the most recent ones that I can think of was specimen retrieval bags. And so typically what happens is you'll realize, hey, we might be able to save a little bit of money in this one. And I want to kind of preface that by saying that we're never looking for cheap or non-quality items. We're always looking for something that's been vetted. Again, one of the benefits, and I guess at some point you might be able to talk about some of the negatives of a GPO, but all of these items that we look that's on a GPO contract have gone through some sort of clinical review. They've gone through different clinical advisory boards. It's usually member driven. And so I know that when I go and look at something that's on a GPO contract, I know for the most part that there's quality behind that product too. So again, just like that, we would all love to drive a Tesla. We'd all love to drive a Lamborghini. But again, sometimes the Nissan gets you where you need to go, and that's all you need. So one of the most recent ones is we were looking at specimen retrieval bags. And there are these devices that go inside when you're using laparoscopic surgery. They're just a little tiny bag. They can put whatever it is that they're taking in. They close it up and they pull it out. And so we identified, a small but relatively easy cost savings. And so we brought in the vendor. They did an analysis. They said, yep, this is great. Here's the facilities that have used them. It's always nice to get references because you want to make sure, hey, when you guys implemented this, did you see anything that had happened wrong? So we went through, we had the vendor on site. They went up to the OR. They did all the training. We got all the sign-off sheets. All of the surgeons that used it said, yeah, it's clinically equivalent. I like to really focus on that term too. So again, there's a difference between clinical preference versus clinically acceptable. And so at the end of the day, they said, yes, these products are clinically acceptable. So I was like, great. It was 3 different SKUs, relatively easy. We switched it. And then as you can imagine, once they start using it on a daily basis, you start hearing all the complaints. And so unfortunately, that one, we ended up going back to the original. Again, we worked through it, and it's always good to, I feel a little bit like I'm rambling, but it's important to say, when you're met with resistance, change is hard for everyone, right? Like we all deal with change on a daily basis. And so when that happens, it's really important to take it with a grain of salt and try to figure out what's the root cause. Why isn't this product working? What don't you like about it? And try to figure out what it is. Because sometimes it's just simply change, right? And in project management, a lot of times you really want to have somebody on the team that is kind of the naysayer, the pessimistic person, because usually they have a lot of insight into why that project might not work. So taking that into supply chain, again, it's important to realize that. So unfortunately, that's one that recently we tried. We used it for a few months, and then at the end of the day, we switched back just because it didn't work for what they needed.
So Gary, I'm kind of going to pivot back over to you a little bit on this, but one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, you're trying to gain trust. You're trying to show like successful implementations. You obviously sign an agreement and, you've kind of put all that time and energy, into working with the supplier, and they've put a lot of time and energy into it. Like, to go back on that decision has gotta have, some pretty, like, there's gotta be some pretty big kickback, I guess. And so, you've gone through all that vetting and then you've got to walk this back. Do you feel like, and Gary, this is really more for you because I know you've been in lots of different organizations, kind of supporting them. When you start to walk it back, I mean, are there some people that just want to keep hammering the initiative forward, even though it's not working, just because they need it to be successful? Or do you feel like people will, if they realize, oh, this just didn't work the way we thought, that they're like easily going to unwind it? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, Justin, I think it can go a lot of different ways on that question. And I think, one, you have to be very sensitive of putting a number in front of some individuals that don't know what the downstream effect is. All of a sudden they see a number and they're like, turn it over tomorrow, get it going, right? And so they hang on to that, or they've already counted that realized savings before it's even been implemented, right? You see $100,000 to switch something, they're like, what does it take to get it done? We got to meet our numbers. We're in a cost containment mode, or we're really focusing on meeting our numbers, as a vendor would say, by the end of the quarter, right? So they're really focused on it. So they want to drive that lane. And sometimes it comes back to Brian's point on the clinical initiative that you have to balance it, right? You really need to understand the mission and the focus of what it looks like. So I think you even take a couple more steps back before the agreement is signed. You're only as good as the agreement is signed. The implementation has to be part of the agreement, if you will, post go live. So what are you going to do to resolve that? You always have to have the parachute on the back end. You got to have the expectation in supply chain that things don't always go perfect like Brian's every implementation does, as you said earlier, and you've got to be ready to pivot. So I think there's two sides of that coin, and I think it's why we've got really good value analysis committees, really got good clinical representation, balancing the fiduciary responsibility, and I think you have to bring those people back to the table when things don't go well. For some reason, that was a miss, or a trial was successful, and then all of a sudden it wasn't working as it should. So I think having that committee that you built to move it forward, having them post go live too on what it looks like, and making sure you have a successful implementation and true realized savings with the clinical balance. I think there's
Brian, how hard was it to unwind that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for us, like Gary's talking about, it really depends on the size of your organization and what type of structure you have in place. Obviously, if you're a larger IDN, you've got a lot more, I would say, oomph behind it. You probably have a very robust clinical value analysis team. We're just one facility. And so it's much easier. I consider us a lot more agile than some of the larger ones. So some of these ones, especially if it's just one product line, one category, if you will, it's relatively easy for us to switch back because it just, we go back into our item master, we make the changes, we use up hopefully the product that we've purchased, and then switch that back. So again, it really depends on the type of organization you're in.
I'm gonna flip this switch a little bit, since we're kind of panel focused. We got the nurse over there with Justin, and we got Brian Bartel with the supply chain guru. You know what? I just want to throw it out there. So as you're rolling down an issue with an implementation, how much do you include the vendor? How much do you hold them accountable? You got the numbers and you got the pricing and you got the T's and C's all locked in. But Brian and Justin, how much do you hold the vendor accountable to? What are you going to do post-implementation? What does your accountability look like? And what are you going to do if Murphy's Law, Pandora's box do show up? What is your ramification? How much do you include the vendor? I want to ask both you guys on that side before I talk way too much. And Hayes would be talking way too much right now too. So go ahead.
I mean, it kind of depends on what the conversion is, right? And what they're selling you on in terms of support afterwards. I mean, if you're talking about a conversion on a purchase service, I'm sort of like, and that's where my experience lies, a lot more, is in purchase services, and especially where you have some regional variability, because it has a lot to do with the staff and the skill level that the company, may have in certain areas. And so, my background, was like instrument repair. And so in that category, like, you can be with a large company and they can be really great in one geography and not so great in another geography, because it really has to do with the technicians that are coming on site. And, sometimes a strategy is to send in the A player, to kind of help, do the initial trial and even the initial implementation. But then ultimately the person who lives locally that's going to be servicing the account, slowly moves into that role. And I've seen that work very, very well. And I've also seen that not work so well. And so, at the end of the day, Gary, in that particular instance, you hold the vendor entirely accountable for post go live implementation and just ongoing maintenance of the program. And if you've got an issue with quality, like in that scenario, then you're really expecting them to send in the person who onboarded the account to kind of do some cleanup and maybe look at, different personnel or what's the corrective action. But, we do a lot of CAPAs, right, in healthcare, and you kind of are expecting the same thing from your supplier, that, that they're going to be able to document, the improvement. And, honestly, some of the times when there was an issue in purchase services too, it was an underutilization, but whoever sold the service. So it also depends on, you have the person who's selling, but then you have the person who's actually doing the work. Sometimes to be competitive on the price, they're, kind of cutting on the service levels. And then when all of a sudden you start to really like get a grip on why there's complaints, it's just because they're being underserviced. And then that's a harder conversation to have, because they got sold one thing and their expectation is cost savings. And then all of a sudden they're realizing that they might have been underserviced even with the incumbent. And all of a sudden the service levels got to go up to address quality concerns. And the only reason there's eyes on it as much is that, like, prior to the change in service, clinicians were sort of accepting a certain level of quality and just, well, we're not going to change, whatever, and then when there is all of a sudden a change, that's when you start to hear something. So these problems may have been going on even with a prior vendor, but then all of a sudden it's bubbling to the surface because everybody's paying attention to the fact that there's a change. And so you got to do a decent amount of legwork on that too. And again, I think you ramp up business reviews at that point. You're touching base more often. And honestly, having been in that vendor position before, that's like, you got to tackle that head on. And if you don't, you're going to lose the business. And I always knew to be really proactive. So my answer to your question is, you absolutely hold the vendor accountable. But if they're really good, they're tackling it head on and as proactive as possible.
Well, and I want Brian to comment, but this is the biggest issue I find. It's like, it's kind of like a job interview, right? Like, you're all jacked up. You're laying out your clothes. You're doing your research. You have your best double Windsor tie tied up on film. You're looking really, really, really good. You sell the deal. You've done everything. And then all of a sudden you get the agreement signed. And then you just start, maybe I'll just do a one loop, not a full Windsor. Maybe I'll just take the tie off, and maybe I'll just have a collar and a sport coat. And then things just kind of slide. You're not getting up early, or maybe you're not doing your 10 push-ups to get your head right. You're just not diving in, and you kind of get lackadaisical once the agreement's signed. It's the implementation side. So selling the whole deal is half the battle. And I just want to see that consistency across the board. And it's just kind of a frustrating piece. The accountability is huge. But Brian, I want you to comment too on just the kind of the vendor input on post agreement and the implementation side too. Your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, just like you said, Gary, and taking a few steps back, and Gary, we've worked on some really large projects over the years, and we know how complex these can be. Part of the role that we have to be in supply chain is forward thinking. And so when you're negotiating these contracts, what is your, what's your termination clause? Are you able to get out with 30, 60, 90 days, or is it something that you're stuck in for 5 years? And so really try to be thinking about that when you're negotiating the contracts up front. Think, if this goes wrong, what can we do? Again, there's always going to be breach. There's going to be different clauses for those sorts of things. But then I use this term quite a bit. There's a really big difference, what Gary's kind of alluding to, the difference between a peddler and a partner. And it becomes very, very clear when you start realizing, hey, this person was here just to sell us something. And that's when you start having those issues. And Gary, you and I know, I mean, over the years, we've dealt with multiple different ones where there are growing pains. When you onboard a new supplier, think of something like when we talk about purchase services, you go from a customer-owned good model where you purchase and launder your own linen and scrubs, and now all of a sudden you're outsourcing that. You've got to have some grace and leeway in that because it's challenging when you onboard a new facility or a group of facilities, and you'll very quickly realize those vendors that are like, you know what? Here's where our shortfalls are. I mean, we've had instances where we meet on an almost daily basis. Hey, update us. Here's all the problems that we're having. We need to get it fixed. Usually when that happens, you can start moving to a weekly meeting and then a monthly meeting. And again, the good vendors, those that are truly partners, are really going to be working to rectify and make better anything that's that you're having issues with. So again, upfront, make sure that you have language in there to protect yourself, and then really identifying what that challenge is and then working together as a partnership. Because again, it's mutually beneficial if things work out.
Did you hear that coin phrase, Justin? Did you hear that?
Peddler to partner. Peddler versus partner.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I'm a big fan of alliteration, Brian. It's one of my favorite things.
I love it.
All right, so we kicked this off talking about, what's an implementation gone bad, right? And so you can always kind of like do the Monday morning quarterback and talk about how things, may or may not fall apart and how to, make sure you've got a parachute in case, or in a case of emergency, break glass kind of thing. But let's talk about what excellence is in this area, right? Because there are plenty of companies and even supply chain professionals and project managers that, can do good implementations. But let's talk about what excellence looks like with that implementation. And, right off the bat, I think having clear expectations, in my mind, and, again, those service level agreements and really having that outlined, I think doing your due diligence to understand the existing inventory is a really big piece. And the vendor can only do so much of that, right? And you only can work with the data that you've got, but sometimes you've got to actually go and gather inventory and data firsthand to help make sure that you're setting that right. So I'll kind of throw that back to you, Brian, but I feel like, doing your homework is one of the biggest things that can really set up for excellence and implementation.
Yeah, it's a great question. And Gary, again, we've done this multiple times in multiple different projects, but you really have to lean on your vendor partner too to say, listen, this is what we're looking at. What have you seen work well? What have you seen not work well? And a lot of times they've already got a list if they're truly working in a partnership to say, listen, we've implemented this in the last 6 months. Here's some things that didn't go right. Here's some things that we had some issues with. But here's what we've identified to make sure that doesn't happen moving forward. And so again, I don't think that there'll ever be a perfect implementation, especially on a large project. But what you have is somebody that's truly dedicated to say, here's some of the roadblocks we're going to face. And I love that. I love sitting in front of somebody that's been in those shoes and walked down that path and said, listen, this is how hard it's going to be. I just want you to be ready for it. I want to be able to, talk to your clinical leaders. If it's non-clinical, I want to talk to those leaders. I want to talk to staff and just let them know it is going to be a challenge. Here's what to expect. But I think that communication is paramount when you're walking down that path.
And something that we lost, and thank gosh we're back in walking the hallways and getting out of your office and walking through the halls. Specifically today, I've had a post-implementation, and I saw one of the key stakeholders, and she was heading to the lunchroom, and I asked her, how was the implementation? How are things going? Straight up, what's happening? She goes, I've heard nothing. That's great. Things are working well. And I told her some things that we were checking in with the vendor just to ensure. We had a QBR coming up just to let her know. She goes, yep, I saw the invite. And that's that whole 30-second conversation that I just conquered face to face versus being on a call. And man, I guess that's one thing that I love is being able to walk the halls put on a pair of scrubs, get in with the key stakeholders and go, what's on your mind? What's happening? And you catch them grabbing a cup of coffee in the break room before they go back into surgery, whatever that looks like, and just say, what's on your mind? What's concerning you? And then all of a sudden something always bubbles up. But I always like to ask that on a post-implementation and just do a check-in. And that's that whole just walking the floors. We get so much by just asking those that are frontline staff. So I really appreciate that. Body language, eye contact, and post-implementation follow-up one-on-one.
What about formal procedures for gathering that feedback? Like, I love what you said, Gary, because I feel like having that face-to-face conversation is one of the best ways to, I feel like sometimes if you send out a survey, people only like fill in what's sort of like top of mind. But when you're actually having a conversation in the kind of day-to-day of it, especially if they're right in the middle of recently using, a product or having a service day or whatever it is, that you're able to dive a little bit deeper and ask some inquisitive, clarifying questions, or you might even get kind of the brain going a little bit. And it's like, oh, you know what? I hadn't really thought about this, but, and then you get a little bit deeper and it allows you to be more proactive. But what about formalized processes for gathering feedback during the implementation, just to make sure that there aren't any of those blind spots that sneak up on you?
Well, first thing I do, Justin, when I want to survey is I just announce Joint Commission in Conference Room C. All directors, please come now. That's kind of what I do to get them there. But I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We value.
That'll get them there, though. Gary.
Absolutely, it'll get them there. But I think
it might be the last time you're there, but that'll get them there to begin with.
Hey, it could be April Fool's Day. Could be a great opportunity. Watch this happen now. Watch it happen. But I think just letting them know your post-implementation expectations of the vendor, the KPIs. I mean, if you have built-in KPIs as a formal document in your agreement that are measures that you're going to put in place post-implementation, why can't you have a formal meeting with your team and say, hey, during safety huddle, we're going to take 5 minutes. Here's a survey. Well, it's 5 questions. Where are we at? Where are we ranked? That's it. And then you could have some follow-up. But I think doing some just accurate documentation, I know we're trying to get quantitative versus qualitative, but maybe a little bit of both. But I think those formal ways is just engaging them to be part of not only the building of the KPIs, because we do that clinically to help them really be a part of the process and the implementation, but post, there's an expectation that we're going to meet with the same group. Maybe it's through value analysis. Maybe it's through a committee that's already there. What's wrong with taking 5 minutes for a document for them to fill out, and we just share with the vendor, this is where we're ranking you. We're hearing it. And maybe they're just speaking to you and giving you that top 30,000 foot level. Everything's great. But when we get down to the end users, maybe there's a little bit of different feel that they can work on. I think you bring up a really valid point.
Brian, so, you had mentioned earlier, you're a little bit smaller facility, right? So Gary just talked about KPIs and, engaging clinicians and establishing those KPIs. So everybody's kind of on the same page with how it's being measured, and then, having a formal process to kind of target and hone in on those KPIs. But, with a smaller facility, like, how easy is it to truly engage the clinical leaders in developing those KPIs when you're, kind of running multiple different projects or sourcing events and trying to set up those contracts, knowing the pressure that everybody's under these days, right? Like, do you have a value analysis committee at your facility, Brian?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And I think you bring up a valid point, Justin, because I worked in other organizations where it is much more structured. You do have a lot more resources. It's challenging, right? So bringing in the clinical leaders, a lot of times it's easy as just walking to their office, having a conversation with them, seeing how things are going, like Gary said, getting out and about and getting their input. And again, when you're out and about having these conversations, you quickly realize if things aren't going well. So KPIs are great. KPIs should absolutely be in a contract, in a partnership, all of that. Same thing with service levels. But again, when you're walking the floors, when you're talking to people, that's when you quickly realize that, hey, things aren't going well or things are going really well too. So again, it's good to have that personalized feedback directly from that. And I think that's what kind of gets lost at the corporate level sometimes, unfortunately, is that they will make certain decisions, which it's fine. But then if you're not working in the hospital setting, if you're not talking to clinicians on a daily basis, if you don't see patients, it's really hard to kind of quantify the changes that you're making too if you're just sitting behind a desk in a corporate office.
We usually hear about it before we even get to that individual a lot of times. Like it's escalated, like CNO is reaching out to you or calling your cell phone or texting you need to follow up, with MedSurge. They've got some questions and, you have a point person you're going to right away and you're triaging. That's called stat triage, Justin. I don't even know that. The old emergency department days, checking in. Stat triage, please. But yeah, those are the stuff we put out the fires. That's what supply chain does. And that's what we try to do. And I always look at supply chain as a whole. So like if you're not hearing about things in your implementation, post-implementation, crickets are good. It's when you're hearing a lot of that. You get a few attaboys, get a few great jobs, but most of the time it's just status quo, get it done, making sure the foundation is built. When you're hearing about it, your job is to fix it, take care of it. It's not personal.
Yeah,
Fix it.
the feedback you should be getting is, hey, that was a really well-run process, right? I felt like I knew what was going on. I felt like I had a vehicle for communicating, and go ahead, Brian. I can hear you.
Yeah.
Something to add.
And this is just because it literally happened today or yesterday. One of my other clinical managers came to me and said, hey, listen, we've got I was down in a different hospital. They had taken somebody that they know to a different hospital. They were in the room and they were having problems with the IV start. And so the needle was stuck. It just sounded like a terrible thing. And so our clinical leader that didn't work at the hospital was like, wait, you're not just going to throw that out? And she's like, oh, yeah, these things aren't very good. We have lots of problems with them. And she's like, no, you need to put that in a biohazard bag and talk to your materials department because they need to know. They need to route that to the vendor. They need to put in a product complaint form. And so I was very proud of her because that's the process that we have is if something's defective or if you don't like it, you need to let us know. Because again, and I hear what you're saying, Gary, and I agree with it, that crickets can be good, but also be aware of that too, that if you don't have that culture of continuous improvement and, high reliable quality. Yes, absolutely. So you do want to have people be able to say, you know what, we just don't like it. Okay, that's great. Well, why don't you like it? Oh, well, I was putting it in a patient and all of a sudden it broke off. Okay, well, that's a problem that we need to know about. And again, it really depends. You want to foster that type of culture where people can raise concerns, questions, and have that feedback. So again, just be cautious in your organization. Make sure that just because you don't hear anything doesn't mean that everything's okay, right? Gary, you've probably walked into different supply rooms and you've seen stuff stuffed in bags with notes like, I hate this and all this stuff. And it's like, all right, obviously there's not a good communication here because either they're super frustrated or there's problems that they're just not bringing up to their leadership too. So make sure that there's an avenue for valid complaints.
Well, yeah. I mean, sometimes you need to, to report an adverse event, right? And the FDA's got the MOD database that, really it's user feedback. And, if you've had something like that happen, you definitely need to make sure that's going through the proper channels just to document it. All right. So we're coming up on the end of the discussion for today's episode, but because we're coming up on the end, I think this is a timely question, which is how do you know an implementation's over? Now, sometimes I think it's very clear and obvious it's over, but when you do have any kind of implementation that's got some complicating factors, and especially when, you're dealing with sort of, end user satisfaction that might not be optimal, like you can really kind of get stuck in this prolonged implementation. It's like we're not walking it back. And at the same time, we're trying to figure out how we're going to kind of get to this place where everybody's like, okay with the new status quo. So I don't know if we'll talk signals here or if there's something more formal or if it's a combination, but like, I'll go ahead and start with you, Gary, on this one. How do you know an implementation is over?
Oh man, it's over when it's over. When I stop distressing myself with false imaginings, I guess that's where it starts.
When you sleep at night again.
Yeah, when I sleep at night or I walk in and everything feels normal. I think when you're key stakeholders, we're handling so many different strategic initiatives and you're triaging as you need to triage and you're following up as you need to. I think it's that same group that you've started the whole go into the process with the key clinical stakeholders and the right supply chain individuals that are part of it, from inventory, from basically doc to doc, in my opinion, from the doc to the doctor. And if it's in their hands and that process flow has shown to be effective all the way down the supply chain initiative and down that timeline of events, to make sure you have the KPIs built in with your first quarter, your second quarter of your vendors' initiatives, whether it's a $20,000 a year savings or a $2.4 billion savings, I think you're feeling, I don't ever want to feel comfortable, I guess. I want to make sure it's good.
I was going to say, I don't think a lot of places formalize it, right? They might stop having meetings, as far as the project.
To Brian's point, pushing them out, right?
Together. Yeah. But I'm not sure that everybody comes together and says, here were the KPIs, here's what we expected. Are there any lingering issues that, we need to make sure we address? Okay. If there's nothing further, Your Honor, I'm going to consider this implementation closed, right? And but I don't think that always happens. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's definitely a challenge. And even after the fact, implementation might theoretically end, but you're always going to have certain things that come up. And like, Gary talked about, it's really important to try to keep your pulse. Gary, you've seen my whiteboard, and you know that all the different projects that we're trying to keep track of. And something as simple as, you're going in for these cost savings, you're looking at on a per line item basis, and you're like, hey, you know what, we've saved X amount this month, but you've also got to look at utilization. So if you're saving $5 per unit, that sounds great. But now if you're using 30 times more units, that's a problem, right? And so even though that might not technically be implementation anymore, you've got to keep a pulse on what's happening in the organization and track that. So KPIs are one function of that, but we have that responsibility on our side too, to make sure that the data and the numbers are making sense on the back end as well. So might be a follow-up to implementation. But again, I guess to kind of formalize a response to what Gary had kind of said too, is when you can stop stressing about it, when it's not a daily conversation or a daily email, you know that's pretty much solidified, and implementation has maybe run its course. So good question. I'll have to think about that one for sure.
Exactly.
All right, guys. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I kind of want to throw it out for any kind of final thoughts, because there are a lot of nuances, and I'll kind of summarize a little bit here, but there's a lot of nuances depending on, what the initiative is. Like we said, is it a product conversion? Is it a purchase service? What are the details of it? How complex is the implementation itself? But I think the KPIs aspect is really, really important, because you want to make sure everybody's on the same page on what does success look like when we get to the end of, this change. And so any final thoughts from you, Brian?
I would just say, especially people that are in a role similar to myself, it's very challenging and frustrating at times. So I have somebody that you can talk to. And Gary, I appreciate the relationship that we fostered over the years. Gary knows I'll call him up, and sometimes I might be overly pessimistic, but it's good to have somebody like that in your corner that can say, hey, I've been there, I understand. And so just having somebody like that, again, Gary, publicly, I just want to thank you for the assistance that you've given me throughout the years. It's appreciated, and it's good. And having conversations like this, everywhere across the nation and throughout the world for that matter, regardless of what type of position you're in, you're going to have bad days, you're going to have frustrations, but it's important, like Gary talks about all the time, mission. At the end of the day, there's a patient that's being taken care of. Hopefully their lives are getting better. There's staff that are being protected by the products that we have. All of these services are really, really benefiting the community. So keep that in the focus too, that, at the end of the day, hopefully we're making a positive impact on somebody that's probably having one of the worst days of their life.
Right on, Brian. And thank you for that too, Ryan. So appreciate it. He brings up a really good point, Justin. It's like being able to discuss with your colleagues across the country, the people that we know, the people that we discuss with, to reach out to a Brian, a Justin, even a Hayes Waldrop can be beneficial. God bless you, Hayes.
Wait till
I just love that I'm getting some punches in here.
On an episode, Gary.
I got some Tyson going on right now. I got some Tyson going. Yeah. And, but no, I really think it is. You know what? You can reach out too, because sometimes, like, Brian says, is like, he brings up some details I don't think about sometimes. Like, sometimes you just get so focused on moving forward. It's like, you need to think about some other things from your colleagues outside the box. Like, from small hospital districts to giant health systems, we're all dealing with a lot of the same things. So there's ways that other people have fixed things or looked at it. And I think using your colleagues and that team approach is really hugely beneficial.
All right, everybody. Well, Brian Bartel, Director of Materials Management at Mckenzie Willamette Medical Center, joining Gary and I today. It's the second episode of this power supply season. More to come. And on behalf of Gary and Hayes, who couldn't join us today, and Brian, who's also part of the team, and like I said, contributing a great deal to the content that we push out on a regular basis, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.